Bread and circuses is the concept going back to Roman times, and let's get our resident historian to explain exactly what it means for the outsider's guide to oppression of the masses and bread and circuses. James.
Well, I guess I am the resident historian here, but anyway, basically it's just this idea that when times are tough, the government uses sort of cheap mass distraction to basically, well, distract everybody to take political pressure off. And this was first coined, I think, by the Roman poet Juvenal in 140 AD when he wrote in his satires about panem et circenses, which meant, well, bread and circuses. This was what the Roman Empire at that time, it was kind of a little bit past its peak, was doing to keep people more or less satisfied, while the government itself was pretty corrupt. And it was just saying, well, we'll put on big games in the Colosseum. A lot of people here will have been to the Colosseum, and we'll hand out free bread. They started a bread dole, a bread queue, essentially, to keep the people of Rome fed. Now, the interesting thing is you go back and you look at it, and you will start to think sometimes, you know, are there some uncomfortable historical parallels between Romans doing that and what some of our politicians do today, especially what they were doing, you know, maybe before the coronavirus with, you know, for example, expenditures on big stadias. And
what a surprise.
Things like that. You know, and middle-class welfare and things like that. And so you start to think, you know, is this bread and circuses, panem et circenses thing something that we really left behind in the Roman Empire after all? And is the Roman Empire something that's entirely distant from us, especially its conclusion? Well,
I think Rita James is absolutely right there. There are so many parallels that you can draw with how governments like to distract the people is one polite way of putting it. Buy them off is another way of putting it, or just keep them entertained over there while the nasty business is happening over here. We've seen during the coronavirus some pretty prime examples, I would have thought, of the bread part of the bread and circuses, which of course would be things like JobSeeker and JobKeeper, and basically money being thrown for people to sit down and not work. Who's going to object to that, Rita?
Well, yes, and I think it's really hidden the full impact of the Australian response. So much focus has been on Victoria, and yeah, Victoria is going to be costing the country in a big way for years to come, because you've got a quarter of the population, a quarter of the economy absolutely at a standstill. But throughout the country, the largesse, the welfare largesse, is really hiding the full impact of Australia's lockdown strategy. And I think once JobKeeper is finished, we're really going to see the true unemployment figures. We had some unemployment figures come out last week. I mean, it's just guesswork. We have no idea what they actually are, because it doesn't include the people who are on JobKeeper, and that welfare's kept people happy. It's kept a lot of people who would otherwise be anti-lockdown in the pro-lockdown camp. In fact, we know from the stats that there's a great many people who are financially better off on JobKeeper, or if they were already on benefits, JobSeeker, now than they were before the pandemic. I mean, it's just utter madness.
Which is insane. Which is totally insane. And James, we know from Rome and from successive emperors and from successive colosseums, and the gladiatorial games got bigger and bigger, so the crowd would soon get bored with seeing one bloke stabbed to death, so he'd have to be gored by a bull first and then challenge a lion, and then some idiot would have to come in, you know, chariot races, then they'd flood the Colosseum, have battles and boats. So what happens with the theory of bread and circuses is that you have to keep the crowd, the masses, the plebs, if you like, completely absorbed and entertained at all times, because the crowd gets bored. And once the crowd gets bored with this particular scenario, they want something bigger and more to keep them entertained. And so successive, and Rita's been watching the brilliant series Rome, successive emperors had to get bigger and bigger and bigger simply to maintain political control, because the crowds were getting restless, James.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look, it's an imperfect analogy, but it is something that I think, just to bring it back to our coronavirus response here in Australia, absolutely fits the bill. I think now something like 52% of Australians are now being entirely supported by the other 48%, whether they're working for the government or for or getting one of the JobKeeper or JobSeeker allowances. So, you know, at some point, the politics of this becomes really, really bad, because neither side of politics then can start to really wind that back without losing a huge amount of political support. And, you know, happily we have our revolutions, you know, at the ballot box, but and not in the streets so much. But this is, you know, we've made for a short term, thinking this is a great idea solution to, you know, how do we get through coronavirus, how do we get through recession, we've now made this huge problem for ourselves, which is how do you unwind this? How do you start to take back the bread and the circuses from people who are on it? And, you know, you see Scott Morrison has completely boxed himself in on this because the states are able to just keep flinging money around, and he's got to keep writing the checks because, you know, if the money stops coming, he's the one who gets blamed ultimately for it. So he's made himself a complete rod for his own back on this. And what's going to happen now, you know, is the same thing that happened in Australia under Hawke and Keating and Howard decades ago. We're going to have to go through all the work again of unwinding the bread and circuses, unwinding the old settlement that has everybody being supported by the government one way or the other. I mean, it'll be a huge opportunity for the people who get to do that, but we're going to lose decades to this, I fear.
Absolutely. And Rita, surely the lockdown has to be the absolute antithesis of bread and circus. Surely it's an insane idea to actually lock your citizens up so they get frustrated, bored, angry, restless. What am I going to do? What's going on?
I don't know. I think a scared populace is very much a submissive one. And if you scare people sufficiently, you can lock them up in their houses and they'll thank you for it. If they're scared for their life, if they genuinely think that this is something like the Spanish flu, that merely coming in contact with it is going to lead to death, regardless of your age, regardless of what your pre-existing health conditions, if any, are, then you can get away with these sort of antics. And I think that's what Scott Morrison has got a fair bit of complicity in. He set the tone. He set up the National Cabinet. And what Andrews has done is an extension of that. Sure, he's taken it to a whole new level, but he probably wouldn't be in a position to do that if it were not for the National Cabinet and for Scott Morrison's harsh lockdown strategy early on.
Well, I agree with you. The National Cabinet is the circus. That's the circus, let me tell you. And it's not very entertaining, and it's certainly not very funny. And it has caused all these problems, James, because, as you said, we are in a situation where you have the keys to the Treasury are held by one mob, and the other mob the keys to the handcuffs to lock you up, so it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, Rowan, what Rita said before was correct. You know, in a weird sort of way, lockdown fetishism can be like a circus for some people in the sense that it's something that's almost entertaining, particularly if you're a well-paid public servant in Victoria on six figures, you know.
Suddenly the roads are empty.
Starter while you're collecting your full salary and zooming into a few meetings, you know, you don't care about it. The one thing that is similar, like entirely similar, between Roman bread and circuses and these is that both are a substitute, but not a good one, for actual good governance.
Absolutely. Rita?
I was just going to say, one part of the circus is these daily press conferences.
Yes,
and I've seen people in the media treat them like, you know, it's almost like they're having bets about what's the figures going to be. I'm waiting in anticipation what the numbers are going to be today. And then, you know, they release a list of people who in the last 20 hours have been fined. And again, it's like a shame file that you entertain the masses with. A woman was caught sitting in her car 7 kilometres from her house. She had no excuse. It really is quite a few parallels when you look a little bit deeper into the detail.
Can I suggest actually off of what Rita's saying there, we need to do a whole outsider's guide to witch hunts, because what she is describing is not bread and circuses, but this is an absolutely puritanical witch hunt out of Salem. You know, I saw Goody Proctor walking around without a mask.
100%. We'll save that one, James. We'll save that one, but in 19th and early 20th century Spain, intellectuals complained of a similar phenomenon in Spanish society called pan y toros, which, of course, is bread and bulls, because, of course, the running of the bulls and the bullfights and all that kept the masses entertained with blood and gore and all the rest. I think we have bread and lots of bull as well going on in Australian politics at the moment, James. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well, look, as I said before, this is all a substitute, but a bad one. for actually, running the country and getting us out of this. And this is the worry that I have, is that there is actually no plan for what happens when we have to stop writing all these checks. How do we get people off of the government teat, which is essentially what we need to do? We need to stop throwing money out the window that we're going to have decades and decades to repay.
So, Rita,
and how are we going to reopen the country? That's another
Correct.
thing, that we are so isolated. We've got hardly any immunity from this virus. And if there is no vaccine in the next 6 months, next 12 months, 2 years, are we going to stay locked away indefinitely for years to come? I mean, that is a frightening prospect that us and New Zealand alone are dealing with. The rest of the world has started to learn to live with this virus in some way or another. But Australia and New Zealand is very different.
The Romans would have just gone to the Colosseum and watched a few Christians being thrown to the lions or something similar, and they probably wouldn't have even worn masks. You never know.